I was thinking on the way down here, thanks to all of you for being here. It's wonderful that you're supporting this great organization. This hall is beautiful. I took a little spin around it. It's gorgeous, so Scituate should be proud of that. This is my 702nd, 702, appearance as an author, and I was thinking on the way down here, this is my 6th appearance in Scituate. That includes a Scituate High School appearance, and 4 appearances at that January supper that Dave Ball used to run up at the church for the Historical Society, which was always a blast. In fact, when I came here today, I was a little disappointed there's no pie here tonight. So, like, the pie was always a big part. You had to pick your pie, put it on your place, and then get settled in, and then it was just an amazing night. So it's great to be back here again. Thanks so much. I'm thrilled to be here for that reason, for sure, but also because Scituate, I believe, is in the top 5 zip codes in the country as far as Irish heritage and Irish population. So just a show of hands, how many people in the room have some Irish heritage in their blood? Okay, that's everybody. I might be the only exception, but that's fine. So, okay, we have one more exception right here. So Voyage of Mercy is my 7th book. Jeeves mentioned that I have 8. Voyage of Mercy is my 7th book. It came out in 2020. I just want to give you a quick kind of summary of that launch. It was an odd launch because the book came out literally 1 week before we shut down for COVID. So I walked into Barnes & Noble in Hingham. I'm from Weymouth. That's my home, Barnes & Noble, Hingham, right? So I walk into the Barnes & Noble in Hingham. It's got great placement, you know, it's on an end cap, I love the way it looks, fabulous, and then we shut down the next week. So sometime around July of 2020, the Barnes & Noble reopens, late June, early July. I go in, the books are in the exact same spot with like this thin layer of dust on them. Very strange, you know, surreal like it was for all of us in many, many ways, but the strangest book launch ever. But I have wonderful readers, very loyal readers. Many of you fall into that category. And the book came out in paperback on schedule 1 year later in May of 2021. So that was fabulous, and it's done well since. So really happy about that. I get emails on this book from all over the country. So not just the Boston area, not just the New England area, but from all over the country, people who did not know the story. They may have known one part of the story, which is the famine, you know, but they didn't know the other part of the story, which is the remarkable American response to it. So I call this, the story itself, a story of soaring goodwill, of generosity and thoughtfulness amidst this unfathomable despair. Really contrasting kinds of things on both sides of the Atlantic. And I talked to a few of you beforehand who have read the book or are reading the book. And the book lays out, you know, pretty easily. That is, I alternate between the U.S. side and the Irish side. That seemed like a natural way to set the book up. And it seemed to flow well. When you look at this overall story, I want you to think about this. We're talking about, when I say the famine, really important to, I guess, stress, we're talking about the Great Irish Famine, which took place from the summer of 1846, around August of 1846, for all of 1847 into 1848, and maybe even a little bit beyond that. So when we talk about the famine, it's the Great Hunger, as the Irish call it, right? There are lots of mini famines in Ireland's history. So always want to be sure when we talk about the Great Famine, right, TGF, that's what we mean, the 1846-1847 nightmare famine for Ireland. On the other side of the ocean, this American response, an incredible response by the American people at this time. It is, the subtitle of this book is The USS Jamestown, the Irish Famine, and the remarkable story of America's first humanitarian mission. It could be the world's first humanitarian mission. This was the first time in recorded history that the people of one country assisted the people of another country on a very broad scale for purely humanitarian and altruistic reasons. This was not the case during this time period, not the case in history prior to this. Countries used to go to war with each other, burn each other's crops, pillage each other's cities, trade with each other occasionally, but for the most part, that's it. This notion of helping, reaching out, just didn't happen prior to this. So it's an extraordinary response by the American people. That's an important part of the story, the other big part of the story. I think it's best to start with the famine. And let me tell you, there are many, many famine scholars who have written many, many books on the famine. You can find books that go into very, very deep detail on the famine, in terms of even caloric intake for the Irish during this period, so things like that. My book does, I think, an overview of the famine. I think it's a good overview. People have told me they've enjoyed it. But so much has been written on the famine, so much I think has been misunderstood about the famine, so I think it's just good to go over it, and if you've heard the stories in your family, you probably can add some of this to it, and later on, after I'm done with my presentation, by the way, I do Q&A. So when we get to the Q&A part, you can ask anything you want. You can ask about the book, you can ask about history, you can ask about writing, and get a lot of writing process questions. You can tell me a story about your ancestors and their stories about the family. We'll try to do as much as we can of that, and I love that interactive part. So when we get to it, please feel free. Do not be shy. It's not a shy group. I've already talked to 10 of you, so it's a good group. But when we get to the Q&A, it's my favorite part. There's no question about it. So feel free. So this famine. Think about this. I don't throw out a lot of numbers during my presentation. But I do throw out some, just to keep a couple in your mind. Prior to the famine, the population of Ireland is about 9 million people, prior to the famine. At the end of the famine years, some historians put that at 1851, some historians put that at 1853. It varies, trust me. At the end of the famine, the population of Ireland is about 6 million people. 3 million people disappear from Ireland during the famine. Of that 3 million, about 1.3 million die from starvation, from diseases related to starvation like scurvy and dysentery and typhoid and things like that. The other 1.6, 1.7 leave Ireland. The great Irish diaspora, right? The great movement of the Irish people from Ireland, in some cases to Britain, reluctantly, in some cases to Europe, in some cases to Canada, but the great number of Irish come to the United States, even if they stopped in Canada first. There are a number who did. They were called two-boaters, right? They would take a boat to Canada first, then leave like Halifax or wherever, and take a boat to Boston or New York. Why? It was cheaper to do it that way. Canada's part of the empire at this point, and so it was cheaper for the Irish to do that. They're called two-boaters, and you have two-boaters in your family history. But that's pretty much what happens. That's the 3 million people that disappear. So people will say to me, there's been many famines after the Irish famine, right? 20th century, Russia, China, Ukraine, Africa, enormous famines that have killed more people. But in terms of the percentage of population of the country and the devastation of the country, the Irish famine is in our hearts and in our minds, I think for a very good reason. That percentage is astonishing, that 33% number. And when you add to that the kind of what I'll call folklore of the famine, that there have been books written about it, poems written about it, songs written about it, poetry done on it, it almost becomes more ingrained in us. And then when you add on top of that, the way the underlying famine affected Irish-British relations for at least 150 years and maybe even to today, right? And Irish-US relations in very different ways, That famine is part and parcel of almost all of modern Irish history. It's at the root of it. It's underneath it. 3 million people starving to death. People being evicted from their homes because the potato famine doesn't allow them enough extra potatoes to sell and pay their rent. The word eviction becomes a dirty word in the Irish lexicon in Ireland and when they come to the United States as well. Picture thousands of starving Irish, barely clad or ill-clad, wandering during the winter of 1846, that is the fall, winter of 1846 into 1847, wandering the roadways of Ireland, starving or evicted already. While in many cases, carts filled with food, guarded by British soldiers, were taken to the ports for export. So one of the images that gets seared into the Irish mindset is the way the British handled this famine. The famine happens very, very quickly, and it comes on the heels of a poor potato crop in 1845. 1846 hits, and at the beginning of August, the potato crop looks pretty luxurious across Ireland. Now, this is a time when about 30% of the Irish people, think about this, 30% of the Irish people rely exclusively on the potato. Exclusively on the potato. They eat it and they sell it as a cash crop. To buy a cart, to buy a shovel, to buy a pig, to buy a donkey. The potato crop fails by the end of August. The fungus that kills the potato crop turns the crop black by the end of August. By October, late September into October, people are already starting to die from hunger. It is one of the worst winters on record in Ireland, that 1846 into 1847. Freezing cold, howling winds, blizzards in Ireland, and almost no food to eat. Almost no food to eat. The British take a really long time to respond. I'm asked often, and there's many Irish scholars that have studied the famine, I'm asked often the negligence and the incompetence that the British displayed, that the Crown and Parliament displayed during this time period, was it a genocide? I don't ascribe to that theory. I think there's very specific, we call that the word genocide is literally invented in 1947 to describe the Holocaust. And the United Nations definition of genocide is the deliberate extermination or attempted extermination of a people by the state for religious or race reasons. Now, there was a period in the famine historiography, I would say, around World War II till about 1980, I'm going to say right in that period, 35, 40 years there, when many Irish scholars did call this a genocide. Since 1980, I think there's been numerous books that have come out that just basically say, I say just, as I say, that the British displayed enormous incompetence, inertia, definitely anti-Catholic leanings, there's no question about it. The British officer that was responsible for the famine relief in Ireland, Sir Charles Trevelyan, actually said, "What hope is there for a nation which relies on potatoes?" Never really saying that the reason the Irish relied on potatoes is because they didn't own the land that they were tilling. And the British would chop up or slice up these pieces of land into very, very narrow plots. And the only crop that provided the nutrients, the minerals, the vitamins, the calories to feed a family of 6 or 8 or 10 or 12, and the Irish birth rate was going up pre-famine, the only crop that could do that was the potato. So they kind of forced into using the potato. They did have other crops, but the potato was the mainstay. And it was devastating. It was devastating in effect. The famine becomes the underlying source of rancor and bitterness between the Irish and the English. over the next century and a half. Underneath it, when you look at everything, when you go through the sources, when you do the research, you find that it happens during the Irish independence movement, right? In the teens, in the 19-teens. During the Second World War. The Second World War, a whole story you could devote a whole book to. Why is that? The Irish. Ireland, the government of Ireland, is one of 6 neutral countries during the Second World War. Winston Churchill asks for their help while Britain is standing alone. The Irish, the De Valera government says no. We want no part of it. So, along with Switzerland, Yemen, Spain, a couple of other countries, Ireland is neutral and even was a haven for Nazis in the 1940s, all the way up to 1945. British ships. The Irish would not allow British ships fleeing from German U-boats up in the Mayo area, the Clare Island area, to find refuge, to seek refuge in Irish ports. Many British soldiers were killed as a result of this. This becomes a real struggle for the Irish people during the Second World War, many of whom hated the Nazis. And becomes a real issue after December 7th, 1941. Because after Pearl Harbor, it's now America's war too, right? They are part of the Allies. And the Irish have a great relationship with the United States, in large part for this mission in 1847. And so the Irish people struggle with this. And in fact, about 50,000 members of the Irish Defense Force essentially defect or commit treason and go and fight for the British during the Second World War. Several of them were even stormed the beaches of Normandy during D-Day. About 3,600 to 4,000 of them died. Many of them come back to Ireland and they are persecuted and prosecuted for what they did. And I want you to think about this when we talk about the long-lasting effects of the famine. That group was not fully pardoned by the Irish government until 2012. In 2012, those members of the Irish Defense Force who went and fought for the Allies in the Second World War against the Irish government's decree were pardoned in 2012. And then when you move up to the Troubles of the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s, at the root of the Troubles is this religious issue, but it goes back to the family. Almost everything, all the songs, and there are a million songs. All goes back to the family. There is no doubt that the famine is at the heart of modern Irish history. And a historian said, in 1999, an Irish historian said, that the Irish famine has been the unseen guest at every Irish dinner table for 150 years. And I think that's true. On the other side of the ocean, people of the United States. Now, in the fall of 1856, some of the Catholic parishes in Boston, New York, Rhode Island, others, are getting reports of a famine. You know, they're taking up collections to send to the Irish people. But there's a real sense of the boy who cried wolf here. Because in these mini famines that had happened before, the Irish had sought money. The churches had sought money for the Irish people. So there's no real idea of how bad things are in that latter part of 1846 and going into 1847. That doesn't happen until late January 20th of 1847, when a ship docks at Boston Harbor and one in New York Harbor from Ireland. And word goes out of how bad things are. Children starving, whole family starving, no food. And in the United States, things happen really quickly. It starts in Boston. It starts in Boston. A big meeting at Faneuil Hall, where all the Boston fathers are meeting, all the prominent business people of Boston are meeting. And included in that meeting, there's 4,000 people at this meeting. What are we going to do about Ireland? Do we have any kind of obligation to help the Irish? And a Boston ship captain and ship owner by the name of Robert Bennett Forbes, who owned the house of Milton, right? The Forbes house of Milton. Main character in this book, my book. Robert Bennett Forbes puts forth a proposal to the congressman who's there. Robert Winthrop was there at the time, Congressman Winthrop. Says this: how about, Bob, Congressman Winthrop, how about you go to Congress and you put forth a bill that says a civilian sea captain can take control of a United States ship that isn't being used, that needs to be retrofitted, that needs to be upgraded a little bit, and I will sail that ship to Ireland laden down with food to help the Irish. Winthrop says that sounds like a pretty good idea. What ship should be used? Well, at the Charlestown Navy Yard, there's a ship called the USS Constitution that had just made like a worldwide tour. We may not want to use that boat. But how about the USS Jamestown? Which is a little bit, and sort of needs to be upgraded a little bit, needs to be painted, needs to be scrubbed. But that's a boat that you could probably use if Congress says okay. Winthrop takes it to Congress in early February. Things move very fast. Early February takes it to Congress. At the same time, a congressman from New York puts forward that a ship captain in New York wants to do the same exact thing with the USS Macedonia in New York. Macedonia gets bogged down in a lot of bureaucracy. Jamestown thing moves really, really quickly. And for the first time in American history, Congress turns over a ship to a civilian captain. That's all happening while other members of Congress put forward a bill that the United States should contribute $500,000 to the Irish people. A bill that passes the Senate, runs into big trouble in the House, and President James K. Polk sends this signal: even if you pass it in the House, I'm going to veto it. I think it's unconstitutional to use American funds to assist in a charitable venture overseas. It's a British possession. Why don't the British do it? That's what's going on. So that bill fails. The Jamestown Amendment does not. But then Congress says, okay, one thing we can do is we can act in an advisory capacity as the American lawmakers, as the American government. So many of the big senators like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay and President Polk himself and others set a committee up in Washington, D.C., and they asked every community in the United States to set up a relief committee for the benefit of Ireland. And lo and behold, guys, when I tell you this, almost every jurisdiction in the United States does so. Cities, small towns, frontier outposts along the Mississippi, the rural area of Detroit at the time. They all set up these committees for the benefit of Ireland. And the American people contribute crops, food, grains, pork, beef, anything you can imagine. They cure it, they dry it, they put it on rafts or small boats, and they send it along the Ohio River, they send it along the Erie Canal to the big port cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and those get sent to Ireland. The USS Jamestown is the first ship to go, March 28th, 1847. Now think about that. The meeting is in February. in Boston at Faneuil Hall. The ship leaves on March 28th, departs the Charlestown Navy on March 28th, laden down with food. Robert Bennett Forbes takes this ragtag group of sailors as his crew, and I use the word sailors lightly. He's got a couple of experienced officers, but most experienced sailors are at the Battle of Veracruz during the Mexican War, right? So he puts ads in the newspaper and gets responses from people who say, I am a cook. I've never sailed before, but I'd like to do this. I am an accountant or a bookkeeper. I've never sailed before, but I'd like to do this. I'm a lawyer. Not too sure how much I can help you, but I'd love to do this. And so Forbes puts all this group together, whips them into shape very, very quickly. They leave on March 28th. They sail to England. They sail to Cork Harbor because the Boston Committee, the New England Committee for the Relief of Ireland and Scotland, Scotland also had some issues with the potato famine, wanted all of the relief to go to Cork, County Cork, which is devastated by the famine. So it's the county and the city as well. Devastated. He pulls into Cork Harbor, Forbes does, and up on the hillside, the cover of Voyage of Mercy, by the way, is the painting that was done when the Jamestown pulls into Cork Harbor. He pulls into Cork Harbor, and up on the hillside, there are bonfires, there are lamps in the cabins because the people know he's coming. It's this deliverance moment. Here comes food. Here comes the Savior from across the sea. And when he gets there, he is met by the other major character of Voyage of Mercy and the other hero of this story, Irish priest Theobald Matthew from Cork City. Matthew is this long-time Irish priest who was one of these priests who was the people's priest. He was the priest that would hear confessions at 5 a.m. or at 11 p.m. because many of his parishioners worked in the fields, couldn't get there otherwise. He was a priest that learned Gaelic because many of the people from the countryside didn't know English. He was a priest who was respectful to poverty, as one of his colleagues said. Would often push back against the hierarchy of the Catholic Church in Ireland and say these people are the most important people you have. They fund our schools. They contribute to our charities. They contribute to the priests' well-being. He was always there for the parishioners. During the famine, he was very instrumental in working in the fever sheds, going into hospitals, giving money to people when he could, allowing people to stay in his home sometime who were wandering the streets whenever he could. It was a practice that he had started in the 1830s during the cholera epidemic in Ireland, and he continued in the 1840s during the famine. Matthew was also very concerned about drinking in Ireland, alcoholism in Ireland. In the 1830s, he gets hundreds of thousands of Irish to sign a temperance pledge. He is called the Apostle of Temperance. Becomes world famous for being that Apostle of Temperance without ever leaving Ireland. The Irish people know that he cares about that. And during the famine, he cares about them even more. And when Robert Bennett Forbes and the Jamestown arrive, Matthew greets them. The two men shake hands and hug. And it's a very emotional moment in Cork. People witness it. The Savior from across the sea, the Savior they know, Father Theobald Matthew. It's a huge kind of emotional moment for the Irish. Both these characters are extraordinary, I think. And when I say characters in nonfiction, we call them characters too, except they're real life characters, right? They're extraordinary men. They give of themselves a great deal. They're generous. Forbes at one point has a little issue of outgoing. He is one of these Hollywood kind of characters who becomes a millionaire before he's 30, loses all of his money before he's 40, gets a lot of it back, goes to China in 1838 because he's broke, participates in the opium trade, which is legal then, to make all his money back. He and his wife, Rose, lose 2 children very early. They have a 3rd child. And in 1838, when Robert Bennett Forbes announces to Rose, I'm going to China, I'm leaving you with our 8-month-old son, because we are destitute. We've lost all our money during the panic of 1837. Made kind of some bad investments, he said. So he goes to China in 1838 for 2 years. For 2 years, Rose is left with the 8-month-old. Very tough time for her. She is very depressed, nearly commits suicide. They exchange letters back and forth. The letters are extraordinary. They sometimes take 5 months to pass in the mail. Right, so think about this today. You text somebody or you use WhatsApp if they're overseas or something. And here's these letters going across. It takes 5 months. In fact, Robert Bennett Forbes would say to Rose, "Please number and date your letters so I know what you're responding to." We kind of know the order of things. When he gets back in 1840, Rose says, "You're sticking around for a while. You've been at sea a lot during our marriage. These last 2 years of the tour, you're sticking around for a while." And he does. They have 3 more children between essentially 1841 and 1847. But when this famine hits, he says, "I must go." Rose says, "Why do you have to be the one to do it?" Robert Bennett Forbes says, "Because it's not an everyday matter to see a nation starving." So he goes. And he really does give of himself during this. He's wealthy at this point, but he's not going with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's not. Kind of never forgets where he came from, and has this real sympathy and empathy for the Irish people. This mission was quite important to him. He said later in his life, "It's the most important thing I ever did." So when you read about these two characters, when you read this narrative, I think you'll enjoy kind of their personal story, as well as, for me, it's all about story. Those of you who read my books know the history is very important. The sources, I think, are ironclad. My primary sources are the foundation of all of my books, but it's all about story for me. I like the story to pull the big history along. So you're almost learning the history in spite of yourself, right? That's kind of the way I take the approach with my books, and I think that's what I did here. Here's the other thing, then I'll get to your questions. This mission doesn't stop with Robert Bennett Forbes and the Jamestown. The Jamestown is the first of 115 ships that would leave laden with food for Ireland between March 28th of 1847 and the 4th of July of 1848, 16 months or so. 115 ships go to Ireland filled with food. It has never happened before. It is the most extraordinary gesture ever. The people of the United States come through in an enormous way. Why? Ask me why. What is it in this period of time, right, that propels them to do that? So when you do history, when you research history, there's hardly ever an envelope, a secret envelope that you find somewhere that says, "Here's why the American people did what they did." You almost never find that. I didn't find it here. But I put together a few reasons so I would call it educated conjecture of all of the elements that come together during this specific time period that caused the American people to give the way they give, and for this giving to happen for the first time in history. Number one, there is a great deal of guilt among Northeast, I call them Northeast progressives, about the Mexican War and the acquisition of Texas, which they viewed as kind of an extension of slavery during this time, 1845, 1846. And this was one way for them to give back, to help a country in a good way, rather than taking Mexico's land and that rather than acquiring Texas to help the Irish in that way. 2, we're in the middle of this in 1847. We're in the middle of massive reform movements in many areas. Mental health reform, education reform, right? All going on. Prison reform, healthcare reform even to some degree. The beginning of the women's suffrage movement is now. The beginning of the abolitionist movement hasn't got its full legs under it yet, but is now. This was another area I think Americans in general thought, here's something else we could do that might be good. 3, we're in the middle of the Second American Reawakening, about 100 years after the first. Mostly the Protestant churches lead this. Let me say to you 2,000 pages of reading on the Second Reawakening, and just sum it up for you. It basically says this, that you as an individual, as an ordinary person, can do good works without a church hierarchy telling you what to do. You can take that into your own hands. That's part of the Second Great Reawakening. That's part of this. And then the fourth element, I think, maybe the most important element, this is right around the advent of the phrase manifest destiny. What's happening in 1846? It's called the Year of Decision. People are pulling up stakes in the east and moving westward, moving west. Manifest destiny kind of gets a bum around in many ways. Some of it's justified, mistreatment of Native Americans, etc. But there are some virtuous parts of manifest destiny too. And one of the virtuous parts, maybe the most virtuous part of the manifest destiny movement, said this, that we, as Americans, we live in a land with thousands of miles of navigable rivers, thousands of acres of arable land, ports that are teeming with fish. We owe it to help others. We owe it to use that abundance to help others. I think all these come together during this period of time and convince the American people that they need to do something for the people of Ireland once word comes back how bad things are. Last thing. This mission was private individuals, private Americans, under kind of the persuasion of the government, contributing. That public-private partnership model of giving continues with us today. It's the way we do charitable contributions today. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll begin for you mail that you get from every possible charitable organization you can imagine. It will continue for the next 6 or 7 weeks, We contribute to Catholic Charities, we contribute to the Combined Jewish Philanthropies, we contribute to the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, at work we contribute. You pick your charity, you contribute to it. It's uniquely American. These kind of NGOs, these kinds of non-profits, it's uniquely American. It started with this model in 1847, and I'll leave you with this stat related to this. In 2019, last time the aggregate numbers were done for Americans contributing to humanitarian aid overseas, America contributed about $120 billion. This is humanitarian aid, not military aid, completely different. Humanitarian aid about $120 billion. $50 billion of that came from the U.S. government. That is to say, you with your tax dollars, right? $50 billion comes from tax dollars. $70 billion, $70 billion, 7 comes from Americans giving privately through all these foundations and all these organizations. So sometimes you'll see this stat that comes out and that says, the United States does not give as much per capita as other countries around the world. I would caution you. Those are almost always government figures. Look at contributions by the government. This whole pot of money, which is more than what the government contributes, given by the American people, is usually not part of that. I'm trying to say to you, you're very, very generous people. It started in 1847, and it's continued for 177 years till today. So, thank you very much. Let me get a drink of water and then questions. All right. And when we do these questions, as long as I can, I'll repeat the question. So as long as I can hear it, you will be able to hear it. So why don't we start with whoever would like to start? Yes, sir. Front row, start in the front row. Go.
Did the Jamestown make more than one trip over?
Yeah, great question. Did Jamestown make more than one trip over? No. Makes one trip, it's there for about 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks, comes back. Forbes writes up a huge report. He's a great writer. He writes letters, he writes logbooks, he writes reports. So the source material was fantastic. But no, it doesn't make another trip. But these other ships go very quickly after that. You know, it's really this extraordinary time, I think, in American history. Excellent. Yeah, what else? Yes, sir.
On the return trips, what do they bring back? Anything?
Yeah, great question. On the return trips, what do they bring back? Mostly just ballast. So there's lots of talk about, do we bring any Irish back? Forbes nixed that from the outset. That is not our mission. We are not equipped to do it. We don't have enough room to do it. We don't have enough food to do it. We're afraid the ship will be swamped. So no, it's mostly ballast they pick up in Scotland and some of the mines, rocks, things like that. But yeah, it's a great question. Thanks. What else? Yes. What's your name?
Jack.
Jack, what do you got?
How many states in total decide to send ships to Ireland?
So when you say how many states in total, I will tell you that the organization kind of happens with the Quakers. They do much of the organizing of this. So every state and every territory in America, every jurisdiction, I would say almost everyone, including little frontier towns along the Mississippi, all take part in this. And then I will say, once they send it east, right, it gets consolidated onto larger ships. Now, you make a good point. There are different towns that want different counties in Ireland to be the recipients of their aid. The people of Steubenville, Ohio, right along the Ohio River, wanted goods to go to mostly Galway, because there were people from Galway in their town. So you did have some of that, but most of those get consolidated into ships. Okay? Good. What else? Yeah?
Did it make a difference?
Yeah, did it make a difference? So listen, I think it makes, and people ask me this, there's no real way to quantify it, but I will say this. I think it makes a small difference. And I think it makes a huge symbolic and emotional difference. And I think it makes an enormous difference in the U.S.-Irish relationship, which becomes strong there and has continued to this day, that kind of Irish-American connection. So it's not it certainly isn't a panacea, but I think enough food gets in there to provide a little bit of relief. Yeah. Over here I saw, yeah.
Question. You gave 4 reasons as to why, sorry, I'm hoarse, I don't know that.
Yeah, it's okay.
As to why this humanitarian aid happened. You never mentioned any indication how much Irish influence was there already in the country from Irish immigrants?
Yeah, great. That's an excellent question. So I give you the 4 reasons, my 4 reasons of why I think everything comes together at this moment. How much influence was there from Irish immigrants in the country? I will tell you, I think it's limited. The great Irish migration to the United States basically starts with the family. I'm not saying there aren't Irish, there are, but if you look at, I use Boston as just a little study period, right? In 1847, the population of Boston is 115,000 people. 37,000 Irish come to Boston in 1847. So the great Irish migration, arrival, however you want to put it, and again, there's Irish that are beforehand, but the great Irish migration is about between 1847 and the Civil War. So that's why you get the complete transformation of Boston to an Irish city. The Irish brigades that fight for the Union during the Civil War, etc. So I'm not saying there's no influence. I think there is some of that, but that Irish influence, let's say pastors at certain parishes and churches and things like that, was there for a while. For this groundswell to happen, as it did between 1847 and 1848, it would not have been through the influence of the Irish here. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, great, excellent.
I've got one more.
Oh, you got one more. Wait, is that okay if she does one more? Yes, okay, go ahead. Yes, of course.
We're both South Africans.
Oh,
So
okay, yeah,
we
welcome.
experienced a bit about British rule. In fact,
Sure, yeah, British rule in South Africa, yeah,
the concentration camp.
yeah.
However, I also know that there's a lot of propaganda on both sides when you get it from different type of media. Was there any interest that, from your research at all, there were Brits that were concerned
Yeah.
about the Irish?
Absolutely, so, yes.
The government didn't allow it, but the local British, surely there must have been something.
So, the question is, were there British that were concerned about the Irish? Absolutely, numerous. In fact, some members of Parliament were very concerned. The Crown, I would say, almost no concern. Victoria had almost no, she sent a couple of kind of cursory messages, please help the Irish, but very, very little concern. The British eventually get their act together in Ireland, I will say. They create soup kitchens in Ireland that eventually feed about 3 million Irish, which is in its own right extraordinary in a country that had almost no interior road system. They barely have an interior road system now. No, they do, but I'm just saying, they had almost no interior road system, and they eventually feed about 3 million Irish, but they don't get up and running until about April of 47. Before that, there's months of British bureaucracy, like how many people are allowed in this. They set up these portable soup kitchens where you went in, you ate your soup, you went out the other door, and a whole new group of people came in and ate. So how many people could come in at one time? How long could they stay? How do we get them out the door? So it's paperwork. There's between January of 47 and April of 47, tons of paperwork the British do on the soup kitchens without a single bowl of soup being served. So, yes, but they eventually do get their act together. But there's some pastors, even Anglican priests, for example, ministers in England who are helpful, who are sympathetic to the Irish. I'm just saying there's no kind of groundswell of support. Trevelyan is, I'd say he's the third major character in the book. Trevelyan really doesn't have a lot of redeeming qualities. He is not a good guy. He does not do what he needs to do to get this Irish relief movement underway. And it's based, I almost think it's based on two things. One, anti-Catholicism, extraordinary anti-Catholicism. But two, the British are a little embarrassed by the Irish. So think about 1846, 1847. When you're in London, this is the Industrial Revolution, right? This is factories, this is decadence, this is, it's incredible. And here you have this backward country with these people who we keep telling them, quit relying on the potato, and they keep relying on it. There's a little embarrassment by the British there. So that's all part of this too, but I deal with that in the book as well. Yeah, great. Let's go way back. Yes, sir. Yeah.
So there's a lot of connection then with the time of the famine to the Civil War. by that time, there's a lot of Irish already in the States. So how much, I guess, logistically, since there's more men, and how much emotionally would you connect the Irish involvement in the Civil War, both Union and Confederacy?
Yeah, so the Irish brigades in the Union are huge, right? They're very important to the Union cause. Almost every northern state has at least one Irish brigade, some many. The Irish run into problems when McClellan, General McClellan, is fired by Abraham Lincoln. There's some real issues among the Irish because they are not happy that McClellan is fired, even though McClellan at that point is a terrible general, right? Lincoln can't get him to move, can't get him to move his horses, can't get him to march or anything like that, so there are some issues there. Some of the Irish, I would call it the Irish black tension, starts during this time too. The abolitionist movement is focused almost entirely on anti-slavery movement, and many Irish immigrants resent it because they're living in squalor in places like Boston and New York, and Providence and Philadelphia and things like that. Even in Boston, I mean, the draft riots happened in 1863. Why? These Irish mothers are sending their sons off to war, and the Irish are living in squalor, right? They're being mistreated on a regular basis, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a yin and yang here going on. You know, the Irish are kind of like big contributors, particularly to the Union cause, and they write some to the Confederacy as well. Some of them go south to the Confederacy, but it's mostly the Union cause. They fight very bravely. They sacrifice a great deal. Many died during the Civil War. At the same time, they feel like they're being mistreated in the cities of the North, mainly the North, right? That's what's happening. My 8th book, not to do a plug, but my 8th book, The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner, of course, is the great anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts. Some Irish are upset at Sumner because he doesn't deal with the problem of what the Irish are going through in Boston at the time, you know. In fact, Boston fills the Back Bay and expands, right, from the Public Garden all the way out to Fenway Park with the brand new Back Bay. Why? Because lots of wealthy Bostonians are leaving Boston because these hoi polloi Irish are arriving. They need to get away from it. And the wealthy fund a lot of things. They fund educational things, they fund cultural things, they do all of that, right? And so how do we keep these wealthy within the confines of Boston? Here's what we do. We fill the Back Bay. We take on the greatest public works project of the 19th century. We fill the Back Bay. We create this kind of high-class, prestigious residential neighborhood. And all the wealthy can go live there, away from the Irish who are teeming in the North End at that point. That's what's going on. That's why the Back Bay is filled, by the way, precisely why. And it works. The project works. The Back Bay is filled. It's a beautiful, residential, prestigious neighborhood. And there's enough separation between the wealthy and the Irish that many of the wealthy stay. So all that's going on. By the way, the people who fill the Back Bay are the Irish, for the most part. The first regular paychecks of the Irish in Boston are the people who fill the Back Bay and build the Back Bay up. Those are mostly Irish. And by the way, a number of them die on that project just because, construction stimulants or anything like that. So yeah, you got all that going on. All that. It's never really simple, you know? So is that good for an answer?
Yeah, do you think that a lot of Irish was kind of like a payback, like thanking the United States?
Yes, I think the Irish, great pride in the Irish Brigades. I mean, if anybody knows anything about like the history of the Irish Brigades or knows people who were involved in it, there's tremendous pride in that. I think there is. I think there's a sense that the United States was good to us, and we do want to give back. I do. But I'm just telling you, when the Irish get here, it's not a walk in the park, right, at all. Farthest thing from it. So, yeah, what else? Yes, Catherine Shannon, Irish expert, who's going to try to stump me right now. No, I know you're not. I'm only kidding. Yes.
That was a very, very certainly the forces in the United States that made that happen. Just a couple of points. The question that came up about were the people in Britain who were concerned.
Yeah.
And yes, there were. And Robert Bennett Forbes actually recruited the biggest philanthropist out of Liverpool to come over and help set up the distribution.
He did, you're right, yep.
To make sure that the food got all through Cork and even into parts of Kerry. And my old grandfather was a recipient of some of the largesse that came on the Jamestown, where he lived near the town of Bandon.
Great.
And I think Lord Bandon was the kind of official head of the district, but of the Cork distribution committee. So, but the other thing I think it's important to mention in relation to Trevelyan is that he really, and he's a civil servant, but with the ministers in the cabinet who were equally imprisoned by laissez-faire ideology and providentialism, which was very, very powerful at the time. And I think that's a dimension that needs to be brought out. And also, the private British Relief Association actually gave more money to Ireland than any of the other groups.
Right.
At the time. And then there were internal groups in Ireland too, the Nation House Committee, where some landlords did money.
You're right, some very charitable landlords that did not collect rent and things like that. But you're right, that laissez-faire thing is a very important thing. That was a big part of the British, I guess, philosophy at the time, because they didn't want to disrupt their corn markets and things like that. That's all part of it. I deal with that a little bit in the book as well, but yeah, that's a great point that you brought up as well.
Another question that maybe you could elaborate on. You brought up the business of this was one way for people who supported the abolitionist cause to register their disagreement with the Mexican War, and certainly that was very important in the captain's view. His friend Hilliard wrote to Rose to tell her, I know it's tough, but you must let him do this.
You must let him do this,
I'm wondering, is there any connection between the research that you did on the Jamestown and your subsequent two books that look at the whole abolitionist question? Did you get into that because of what you discovered at that time?
Yeah, so is there a connection between the Jamestown and the great abolitionist Sumner book? Not so much directly. I knew that was Sumner was around during that time, during that Jamestown time. But I wouldn't say it was a direct kind of connection. I came across the Jamestown story when I was doing A City So Grand, which has a big chapter in there on the Irish arrival in Boston and growth in Boston and things like that. So, but I wouldn't say that the Sumner thing connected directly. The abolitionist part, the Irish relationship with the abolitionists, which was strained, I would say from the beginning, very strained. That's part of I would say, Boston history, and even beyond Boston. But because of the small geography of the city of Boston, it's kind of right in their face, if you know what I mean. Most of the Irish were in the North End at the time, but it's kind of right there. It's so crowded at the time, and that's part of what happens, and part of the tension between that Black-Irish tension that starts very early. Yeah, it's good. Thanks. What else?
I'm interested in Mr. Forbes. What was his connection to Ireland? Was he Irish?
No, so Forbes' connection to Ireland, not really. He's one of these guys who did a lot of time at sea, probably saw more time at sea than anybody of his era, I would say. Was a cabin boy at the age of 10 on a ship to China. He was captain of a ship to China when he was 20 years old. There's one period of time between the ages of 17 and 27 where he says he was only on land 6 months out of that 10-year period. So he's a swashbuckler guy, he likes the adventure, and so, but I think he's one of these people that has a conscience, one of these people that did want to give back, and he has this expertise, he knows how to captain ships, knows how to build ships, knows how to own ships. He knows how to put a crew together. You know, he's done all of that since he was very, very young. Takes his first trip across the Atlantic when he's 6 years old, when his mother takes him and his brother across, chasing after their ne'er-do-well father, who went to Europe. You know, yeah. So I mean, so I think that's really at the heart of it. You know? Yeah.
So are the descendants the current Forbes family?
Yeah, there's Forbes, so like that John Carey Forbes Carey Wayne, there's some connection to it, not direct descendants, but the sort of wealthier Forbes, he is not a wealthy person when he starts. He, like I said, he makes his money, is a millionaire by the time he's 30 in these mercantile shipping activities, and then loses it all in the Panic of 1837, you know. So he's one of these people who is a writer and a doer. What I love about him as a character is he wrote hundreds of letters, logbooks, reports, did all that. He's a very good writer. But he also did a lot, you know, so he's really one of these well-rounded guys. He's probably not as sensitive as he should be when he's away from Rose. And, you know, she at some point in her letter says, I want to sleep the sleep from which there is no waking. Words to that effect. And he basically says, you know, get it together, you gotta buck up, and, you know, I'll be home shortly. So, I mean, but I think that's also part of the time period, you know. So yeah, I think overall, he's got a lot of virtue, you know, I'll say that. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I hate to digress, but I find the presentation excellent. And
That's not a digression when you say you find my presentation, that's excellent.
I noticed that this is being recorded, and I was wondering if there was a way that we could access this recording so that I could watch this again.
I think this gentleman might be the better person to answer that, or Gigi, or somebody it's fine with me.
Yeah.
Yes, I always say that. I'm not one of these people who says, do not look at my stuff, I have a copyright. Please, look at my stuff and send it any way you want to send it. I like that. It's
Thank you very much.
perfectly okay with me, yes.
Stephen, it should be on Scituate Community Television, YouTube.
Oh, on Scituate Community Television, it'll be on. You know, so I don't know. You know, you must have like a local cable TV that you can look up the.
I'm not from Scituate, but
Oh, okay.
maybe I can find it.
Yeah, and at some point,
They have a YouTube channel also.
yeah, I was just gonna say, at some point, I'll put it in my own. I'll link to it if these guys give it me, or I know it, I'll link to it in my own. And so when you get are you on my mailing list?
I am not.
Okay. Later on, sign my mailing list. I do like about 4 or 5 newsletters a year.
Right.
I just need your name and email, and you can get on that. I'll be doing one in December, so I'm assuming that we can do something by then.
Wonderful.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
What are you working on now?
Right now, I'm working on book 9, which is very exciting. A little too early to tell you the topic, but I'm very excited about it. I think you're going to like it. If you want to, I'll tell you this, if you get on the mailing list, you'll be one of the first several thousand people to know. How's that? Yes.
After the famine, were they able to diversify the profit?
Yeah, not so much. After the famine were they able to diversify a little bit, but one of the things I always say is, like 30 years later, 1879, there's another pretty massive famine. When the United States does the same thing, sends ships over there with food. But so it takes a while, and I think you would say, Catherine, you can jump in here, I think you would say it goes into, you know, the 20th century, you know, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Actually, there's another fairly serious one in 1861, 62 that affected the West Side and Clare and Galway and other areas. And interestingly enough, you know, America's in the Civil War.
Yeah.
So fundraising efforts were very, very difficult at that time. There was also a recession in the United States at the same time. Nevertheless, the Irish network, particularly through the priests and through the colleagues in Boston Pilot, organized relief efforts, and it did send a considerable amount of money. at that time, right after the beginning of 1863. The next period of severe difficulty was 1879 to 82, which is often called the forgotten famine, because it affected only the areas west of the Shannon. And these were the areas where rationalization of land usage did not take place. It mostly took place east of the Shannon and in Munster. And by that, it took a couple of forms, one of which was to turn a lot of the land over to grazing as opposed to planting crops, which of course meant less demand for labor and created another incentive for people to come. But the other thing that happened was the end of subdivision, when you carve up the family plot and give it to 3 or 4 sons or whatever. After that, the primogeniture, that the oldest son got everything, or the one who's chosen got everything. And that was a big driver of immigration for many families. You know, and they could afford to give the land to one son and a dowry to one daughter, and the rest of the kids would have to go. Massive immigration was coming all at that time. And what's particularly interesting is that Ireland never went back to a population the size of what it was in 1861 until, I think, 2012. When all the other European countries, their populations were going up. In Ireland, depopulation goes down. And at one point, it was as low as, I think, 300 people around.
I want to say, Ron,
1950.
I think you're right. I think right after the Second World War, very, very small. I'm not even sure where it is now.
It's, well, it's approaching about 7.5.
Yeah, but I was going to say, it's still less than before the famine years.
It's not a exit border.
Right.
Although that may change with all the immigration that's coming in.
Yeah. What else? You good? Yeah. Yeah, did the U.S. inspire other nations? So some people in the empire give. Australia gives, India gives, Canada gives some, but not to that extent. Not to the extent that the U.S. gave. I'd say that, you know. And there are a couple of European countries that do as well. Yeah.
The carpenters that you hear are called, did they bring people over and they were then returned to, they didn't return in the 20th century?
So the ships that emigrate from Ireland and come here, so many die on the way. That's what they call the coffin ships, yeah. Well, by that point, no, they weren't used to help out. So most of that effort comes, like I said, almost all comes from the United States, yeah.
I read one place, I don't know if you saw through any of the primary sources, any veracity that claimed that Native Americans also contributed and supported.
Yeah, so there's a great Native American connection. One of the things, and I talk a little bit about it in the book, but one of the things that the Choctaw Nation contributes, so the Trail of Tears Choctaws contribute, I think it's $170. Some people did contribute money. I think it's $170 when they find out about the Irish plight. And it kind of starts this connection between Native Americans and Ireland. And Mary Robinson, the president in the mid-90s, I think becomes, she's named like an elder of the Choctaw Nation as a result of that connection. And during the pandemic, our pandemic in 2020, Ireland sends aid to the Choctaw and the Navajo, I think, as part of that connection that starts in 1847. Yeah.
Just elaborate.
Yes.
Scholars in Canada are uncovering considerable donations from Native Indians in Canada that went over in the 1840s.
Great. I know that. That's good. All right, you guys, doing great, thank you so much. So,